I have spent 30 years studying Persian Gulf security architecture and energy supply chain vulnerability. I have briefed three administrations on Strait of Hormuz contingencies. I have run simulations on coordinated drone swarm attacks against critical infrastructure. Nothing in those 3 decades prepared me for what arrived over Saudi Arabia at 0347 hours local time this morning. 2,500 Iranian Shahed 136 loitering munitions launched in coordinated waves from at least 14 hardened sites across western Iran struck the Abqaiq processing facility and the Ras Tanura export terminal. The attacks destroyed approximately 60% of Saudi Arabia's refining capacity in under 4 hours. The Brent crude futures market opened at $112 per barrel. Pump prices in the United States crossed $10 per gallon in major metropolitan markets within 8 hours of the strike. And the President of the United States issued a statement calling for de-escalation without naming Iran, without committing forces, and without articulating any credible deterrent response. I want to be honest with you about something. When I first saw the infrared satellite imaging from that strike, my first reaction was professional respect, not approval. Respect. The operational planning, the deception architecture, the timing against a kingdom that spent $80 billion on air defense systems over the last decade. This was not improvisation. This was a years-long preparation executed with precision that most Western militaries could not replicate, and the human cost is already mounting. 14 Saudi Aramco engineers confirmed dead. Another 63 workers unaccounted for in the rubble at Abqaiq. Families waiting for news that may never come. This is not a geopolitical chess move. This is fire and blood delivered at industrial scale. In the next 38 minutes, I am going to walk you through 4 questions that every serious observer needs answered. First, how did Iran coordinate a 2,500 drone assault without triggering early warning systems that were specifically designed to detect this exact threat? Second, what does the 60% refining capacity loss mean in mathematical terms for global supply and why the market cannot absorb this shock? Third, why has Washington offered nothing but rhetorical condemnation when treaty obligations and decades of security guarantees are now being tested in real time? And fourth, what does Moscow, Beijing, and the developing world see when they watch the United States refuse to act while a client state burns? If this is the kind of analysis you have been looking for, the kind that does not sanitize the strategic verdict or manage your expectations with comfortable lies, subscribe and stay with me. Hit like, drop your assessment in the comments. I read them. What I am about to show you will not appear in the sanitized briefings or the polite think tank panels. Let me walk you through exactly what happened. Phase 1 began at 0347 local time. The first wave consisted of approximately 400 Shahed 136 drones launched from sites near Kermanshah, Hamadan, and Sanandaj in western Iran. Flight time to target, roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes. The drones flew nap of the earth profiles, exploiting terrain masking in the Zagros mountain range before crossing into Iraqi airspace at altitudes below 200 meters. Saudi Arabia's ANTPY-2 X-band radar systems, positioned to detect ballistic missile launches, were optimized for high-altitude threats. These drones flew beneath the detection threshold. The Patriot batteries ringing Abqaiq were cued for faster-moving targets. A Shahed 136 flies at approximately 185 kilometers per hour. Subsonic, low radar cross-section. Expendable. Each unit cost the Iranians approximately $20,000. The fire control radars designed to intercept them cost $40 million per battery. Do that math. Phase 2 initiated 16 minutes after the first impacts. A second wave of 600 drones launched from deeper Iranian territory, this time from sites near Shiraz and Bushehr, targeted Ras Tanura. This is the largest offshore oil loading facility on Earth. 17 berths. capacity to load 8 million barrels per day. The drones arrived in staggered pulses, overwhelming the point defense systems through sheer volume. The Saudis fired approximately 270 Patriot interceptors. They achieved a kill rate of roughly 38%. That means 162 drones were destroyed. 438 reached their targets. Each Patriot interceptor costs $4 million. The Saudis expended over $1 billion in munitions in under an hour defending infrastructure that was still destroyed. The Iranians spent $8.7 million on the drones that got through, a 100-to-1 return on investment in favor of the attacker. That is not warfare. That is arithmetic. Let me be precise about this. Phase 3 was not about additional destruction. It was about message discipline. Between Aero 520 and Suro 640, a third wave of 700 drones targeted secondary infrastructure, pumping stations, storage tank farms, and the east-west pipeline terminus at Yanbu on the Red Sea coast. These were not the highest value targets. They were symbolic targets. Iran was demonstrating that it could reach the Red Sea littoral, that it could strike the export alternate routes, and that Saudi Arabia's defense in depth was a fiction. 11 of 14 pumping stations along the east-west pipeline sustained damage. The pipeline moves 5 million barrels per day when operational. It is not operational. Repair timelines are estimated at 9 to 14 months, assuming component availability and security conditions that do not currently exist. I want you to understand what 60% refining capacity loss means in operational terms. Saudi Arabia processes approximately 7.2 million barrels per day domestically. Abqaiq alone handles 5 million barrels per day of Arabian extra light and Arabian light crude. Ras Tanura refines another 0.8 million barrels per day. The strikes destroyed or rendered inoperable approximately 4.3 million barrels per day of refining throughput. Global refining spare capacity as of last month was 1.1 million barrels per day. The delta is 3.2 million barrels per day that the market cannot replace. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases that Washington announced within 6 hours of the attack total 1 million barrels per day for 90 days. That does not close the gap. That does not stabilize prices. That is a political gesture marketed as a solution. Phase 4 is the phase that Washington does not want to discuss. At 0710, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy deployed 12 fast attack craft from Bandar Abbas into the Strait of Hormuz, not to close the strait, to demonstrate presence, to send the message that escalation dominance belongs to Tehran. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, issued a statement calling for freedom of navigation and international maritime law. It did not sortie additional assets. It did not establish a blockade perimeter. It did not forward deploy carrier air wings. The Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, currently in the Eastern Mediterranean, received no redeployment orders. The Ford Strike Group in the Philippine Sea received no redeployment orders. Washington issued talking points. Iran deployed kinetic assets. That contrast tells you everything about the strategic balance that now governs the Gulf. Stay with me, because what comes next is what matters. Let me tell you something about the Shahed 136 that the public discourse has not absorbed. This is not a sophisticated system. It is a piston-engine drone with a 50-kilogram warhead, commercial GPS navigation, and a radar cross-section comparable to a large bird. It is built from components available on the international market. Iran manufactures them in serial production at facilities that have absorbed 15 years of sanctions pressure. They cost $20,000 per unit. A Tomahawk cruise missile costs $2 million. An ATAC EMS missile costs $1.7 million. A Jassimer costs $1.4 million. Iran has demonstrated that it can achieve strategic effects with weapons that cost 1% of the Western equivalent That is not a capability gap. That is a business model problem. Here is what is actually happening in the war rooms that I used to sit in. The Pentagon is running scenarios right now on retaliatory strike packages against Iranian drone production facilities. Those scenarios require suppression of enemy air defenses, which means strikes against the Iranian integrated air defense system. That system includes Russian supplied S-300 batteries and domestically produced Bavar 373 systems. Suppression missions require fifth generation aircraft, standoff munitions, and electronic warfare packages. The mission planning cycle for that kind of operation runs 3 to 6 weeks, assuming no political constraints. The operational risk is high. The probability of mission failure is non-trivial. And the probability that Iran responds with further escalation, including closure of the Strait of Hormuz, is near certainty. That is why the president issued a statement instead of a strike order, not because the option does not exist, because the cost of the option exceeds the tolerance of the decision makers. I want to come back to a point I made earlier about the defense economics. Saudi Arabia has spent $80 billion on air and missile defense since 2014. That includes 6 Patriot battalions, 4 THAAD batteries, and a network of early warning radars. The system was designed explicitly to defend against Iranian missile and drone threats. It failed, not because the technology is inadequate, because the technology is optimized for a different threat model. Patriots are designed to intercept ballistic missiles and manned aircraft. They can engage drones, but the cost per kill is prohibitive. A $4 million interceptor against a $20,000 target is a losing trade. The Saudis fired 270 interceptors and stopped 38% of the incoming drones. That is a passing grade in a classroom. It is a failing grade when 60% of your refining capacity is on fire. Let me be direct about something. The question that is being asked in classified settings right now is not whether the United States has the capability to retaliate. The question is whether the United States has the will to accept the consequences of retaliation. Iran has spent 2 decades building a multi-domain deterrent specifically designed to hold Gulf energy infrastructure hostage. Drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, fast attack craft, undersea mines, proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Every element of that architecture was visible. Every element was briefed. Every element was assessed as a critical threat. And every administration chose to defer the confrontation. That deferral has now come due. The bill is 60% of Saudi refining capacity and $10 gasoline. Here is the forbidden truth that will not be stated in any official briefing. The United States no longer possesses escalation dominance in the Persian Gulf. Escalation dominance means the ability to credibly threaten a higher level of violence than your adversary is willing to accept. Iran has demonstrated that it can impose costs on American allies and American economic interests that exceed Washington's willingness to respond. That is not a guess. That is the observable strategic verdict of the last 72 hours. The president called for de-escalation. Iran called his bluff. The Saudis are burning. And the global oil market is pricing in a new reality. American security guarantees are not operative under current leadership. What happened over Saudi Arabia is not a local energy crisis. It is a global strategic shift. In Moscow, the Kremlin is watching the Brent crude price with satisfaction. Russia's federal budget breaks even at $70 per barrel. The current price is $112 per barrel. Every day that price holds, Moscow earns an additional $400 million in export revenue. That revenue finances the war in Ukraine, rebuilds the defense industrial base, and cushions the economy against sanctions pressure. Iran just handed Russia a fiscal windfall without Moscow firing a shot. In Beijing, the Central Military Commission is studying the drone swarm tactics with professional interest. The People's Liberation Army has invested heavily in autonomous swarm technology for the past decade. What Iran demonstrated is that mass-produced expendable systems can overwhelm sophisticated point defenses through volume. That lesson applies directly to a Taiwan scenario. Chinese military planners are now modeling how many thousand drones it would take to suppress Taiwanese air defenses and overwhelm Patriot batteries before the first wave of manned aircraft arrives. Iran just provided the proof of concept. For the Gulf states, this attack is an existential reckoning. The Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, every government in the region has operated under the assumption that American military power guarantees their security. That assumption is now visibly false. The Saudis spent $80 billion on American defense systems and still lost 60% of their refining capacity in 4 hours. The message to every Gulf monarchy is clear. Washington cannot protect you, and Tehran can reach you. Expect a wave of quiet diplomatic outreach from the Gulf states to Tehran in the coming months. Expect defense diversification toward Chinese and Russian systems. Expect a slow but irreversible realignment away from exclusive dependence on American security guarantees. For the broader developing world, this is a demonstration of multipolar possibility. A middle power with a GDP smaller than Texas just imposed strategic costs on the global hegemon and its wealthiest client state. Iran did it with weapons that cost a fraction of Western equivalents. It did it despite 15 years of crushing sanctions. It did it despite diplomatic isolation and repeated threats of military retaliation. And it succeeded. That success will be studied in defense ministries from Brasilia to Jakarta. The lesson is not ideological. The lesson is operational. Asymmetric capabilities can neutralize symmetric advantages if the adversary lacks the will to absorb costs. I have said for years in testimony, in written assessments, in private conversations with serving flag officers that the United States has not prepared for the drone swarm threat at scale. I was told that the threat was acknowledged, that programs were in development, that directed energy systems and next-generation interceptors were in the pipeline. I was told that the Saudis had the best American technology and that the integrated air defense system would hold. I want to be precise about this. I was wrong to accept those assurances. The failure is not technological. The failure is strategic. We built a defense architecture optimized for a Cold War threat model and expected it to defeat a 21st century swarm. That assumption was wrong. Let me tell you what happens next. The oil price will remain elevated for a minimum of 6 to 9 months. Repair timelines for Abqaiq and Ras Tanura are not measured in weeks. The Saudis will attempt to ramp up production at undamaged facilities, but spare capacity is limited and production increases take time. The global economy will absorb a sustained energy price shock. Inflation, already elevated, will accelerate. Central banks will face the choice between tightening monetary policy into a slowdown or allowing inflation to run. That is stagflation. That is the economic inheritance of strategic neglect. Washington will continue to call for de-escalation because Washington has no other play. A retaliatory strike against Iran carries the risk of Strait of Hormuz closure, which would remove another 15% of global oil supply from the market overnight. Brent crude would hit $180 per barrel within hours. Gasoline in the United States would hit $15 per gallon. That scenario is politically unsurvivable for any administration. So the president will issue statements. The Secretary of State will engage in shuttle diplomacy. The Pentagon will posture forces and leak strike options to the press. And Iran will interpret all of it correctly as theater, not strategy. The question I want to leave you with is this: does the United States have any remaining credible military option in the Persian Gulf that does not trigger economic catastrophe, or has deterrence collapsed entirely? Think carefully about that. Look at the pattern of the last 72 hours. Look at the response. Look at the gap between the rhetoric and the action, and then ask yourself what happens the next time Tehran decides to demonstrate reach. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one. If this analysis delivered something the mainstream will not say, share it, hit like, subscribe. The next breakdown is already in work. I will see you in the next one.